I'm Dr. Michele Ross. I'm the CEO of Infused Partners, and you're listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what
It gives
do
me
they
great
do,
pleasure to welcome
those
to the pod today
circles
Dr.
around
Michele Ross, clinician, patient, and all round expert on plant based medicines. Across our discussion today, we'll be covering a plethora of uses for plant medicine, with a focus on cannabis and kratom, and how these can be applied in a therapeutic context in healing both physical and emotional pain. She is an all round rock star and someone we are delighted to be speaking with today. So, with that in mind, Michele, welcome to the Professionally Cannabis podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to talk about my passion, which is plant medicine. I live it, breathe it, and dream about it. So,
Well, you're in the right place then. And so we'll begin with our first question, which I think I almost want to alter in your case, because normally we ask what led you to the plant, but perhaps for you it's what led you to the plants.
well, we'll start off with cannabis, and it's funny because we always talk about cannabis as a gateway drug, right? And we know that theory's been bashed, but for me, cannabis was actually the gateway to learning and studying all the other drugs. And so I actually grew up in New Jersey in front of a crack house. So I was very, very much passionate about helping people that were addicted to drugs. And I knew I wanted to go to medical school or something, to be able to help people. It wasn't until later on that I realized that there were other options, like, for example, scientists, research. Ways to help people get off drugs or develop good drugs for doctors, and so I went down that path, down the PhD path. But my very first introduction to the cannabis plant was actually when I started to write my first paper as a PhD student in neuroscience. And I wrote about brain cell growth and cannabinoids. And that was back in 2006. So, goodness, 15 years ago. And from then, I just started realizing that, hey, maybe cannabis wasn't this bad plant. Maybe it's a good plant. Maybe it can help grow brain cells. Else can I do for the brain? And then that led me to learn more about other plants. We're finding now that all the psychedelics, from psilocybin, technically not a plant, it's a fungi, but we find that that increases serotonin in the brain and that increases brain cells. It was just like, I had been trained for so many years as a scientist that drugs are bad, and then to find out that they actually have these beneficial applications. And so that sort of led me away from the traditional academic path of, hey, let's become a professor, let's have a lab and get funding from the United States, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and be studying, hey, let's get people off of drugs. Instead, in the back of my mind, it was like, hey, what can drugs be used for? So I didn't fit in. I didn't fit in that, like, that that role of the traditional professor. And so I ended up doing, many veerings off the path in my life. But really, cannabis led me to my psilocybin work, which magic mushrooms, which led me to, studying other types of plant medicine, including kratom, ayahuasca, and some of these other amazing, amazing medicines. So for me, it started off professionally as a graduate student studying what should have been the harms of these drugs and finding out that there were benefits. And then, what's interesting is as a professor, you can't be doing these type of, what they considered recreational drugs. You can't have a license to study them and be using them. So once I was out of the academic setting, I was actually able to consume cannabis and consume some of these substances. And I didn't do it so much recreationally. I did it because I had some medical needs. I have fibromyalgia and a whole bunch of other health problems. And really, cannabis and these other plant medicines have been the one thing that have actually made me healthy, gotten me off all of my prescription drugs, and really led me to a quality life. So I've sort of combined like my professional love of the plant medicine with actually using it myself, and then my career now is actually sharing, the education about these plant medicines with other clinicians.
I'd love to dive into that aspect of plant medicines in your life, because it's quite unique on this pod for us to be speaking with someone from the sort of medical fraternity, but also has first-hand experience of plant medicines and their therapeutic benefits for them in particular. For you, and with your use of cannabis and other plant medicines, how have you found the therapeutic qualities of these plant medicines differ to the traditional medicines that you might have been using before? And what are these plant medicines giving you that those traditional medicines hadn't been? And then maybe if I can add a third part into that as well, and I'm sorry, it's a 3-part questions. Regular listeners to the show will know I love a really overextended question, but as a doctor and as someone with a science background, do you think that your sort of route into using plant medicines was easier, harder, or somewhere in the middle, like a lot of these things are?
Okay. And I have fibromyalgia, which one of the symptoms is a little bit of inattention and brain fog. So if I forget all the parts, please remind me. But in terms of my journey into cannabis and plant medicine and whether it was easier or harder than the average patient, I would say it was probably the same, because the thing is when you are a chronic pain patient, you're in pain. And that sometimes fogs your thinking, right? You're just struggling to not be in pain anymore. It doesn't matter what your profession is. It doesn't matter whether you're a doctor in pain, whether you're a janitor in pain. It doesn't matter. Really, pain reduces you to this very vulnerable, person. And it's the same thing like, when it was like, we're talking about people that have poverty, right? It's like they reduce their IQ. Pain reduces your IQ in some sense. So it really sort of levels out the playing field. So here I am, a pain patient that's just struggling to make it through the day, struggling to not be at a level 10, pain level, which is pretty high. But that was sort of where I was living because of my different health issues. When you're at a level 10 pain, you just like, give me whatever works to stop the pain. And so, in the beginning, I just struggled, trying to figure out, okay, what do I smoke? What do I eat? What do I use? There's 1,000 different cannabis products out there, right? There's all these different strains. There's all these different edibles. There's different doses of edibles. There's tinctures. There's topicals. There's patches. There's all these different things, right? And so there's thousands of these different products out there. And there wasn't a lot of education about cannabis, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And there's a lot more education on there now. And I would say if I had gone through this whole process now, it would be way easier. But the problem wasn't, it was easy for me because I was a scientist. There was no information out there at all. And so it didn't matter if I was a scientist or not. Like I couldn't figure out what strains were right for anything. But my journey with cannabis medicine was I wanted to find natural plant-based products that were going to provide efficacy in a way that my medications weren't. So as a patient with fibromyalgia, you're prescribed pain medication. So sometimes opioids, sometimes what's typically thought of antidepressant medicines, even though they're not being used for depression, they're working on the serotonin system. There's other drugs like Lyrica, things like that, that don't have a really good efficacy for controlling pain, but they're prescribed anyways. And so a typical patient is like on like 10 different drugs. What's worse about it is that none of these drugs work very well. And they're usually prescribing one drug to like offset the side effects of another drug. But it's like you're literally taking 10 drugs and you still don't feel better, or you're sleepy all day, things like that. So for me as a scientist, it wasn't working for me. I was like, clearly like, I'm taking drugs that like work in 5% of people and they're not doing anything for me. And my doctor has no other options. Like, this is it. Like, this is your life. Maybe go on disability, don't work anymore as a professor, like just sit at home. And I'm like, I can't deal with this. This is not, what I want for my life in my 30s. And so for me, when I started to experiment with cannabis, it was so interesting because it was very different to work with a plant as a patient instead of just like, very, very rigid, professional studying it in a lab or something like that, So here I was, smoking marijuana, and that was something like I would have never done in my life, right? And for me, it was funny because I'm a bad weed smoker, and it's sort of funny. It's like
what constitutes a bad weed smoker? So I know.
Okay, yeah. So, there's some people that consume cannabis and they're like literally from the first or second time they're like, oh my goodness, it reduced my pain so much, it was amazing. Like they have good experiences, they feel relaxed and great. And then there's other people that consume it and they're paranoid, or they don't like they don't feel okay. I always felt like anxious. My pain was never really relieved, and I know that there's like 90% of fibromyalgia patients respond really well to smoking marijuana, and I don't. And it's funny, I tried like for 3 weeks to smoking straight, and I was like, it's gonna get better, and it just is not my route of administration. I don't know whether it doesn't matter what strain it is. Like at first I thought it was, hey, I'm smoking the wrong strains. Like I've tried hundreds of strains. There's really like like maybe like 2 strains out of 1,000 that like don't make me anxious. And it's sort of funny. It's just like we all have a different brain chemistry and things like that. But for me, I use topicals for my pain relief. I use edibles at night. Edibles are really great because it helps me stay asleep and it helps me with the pain at night so I don't wake up. And if I get good sleep, my symptoms are better during the day. So for me, like I love edibles. I'll even use edibles recreationally. But if someone gives me a joint to smoke, I'm not going to have fun. So it's just like, it's sort of interesting. It's like just because you work in cannabis or just because you understand cannabis doesn't mean like you love all the parts of cannabis. I think that everyone on this journey has to remember like there's different products for different people, and that's
Mm.
okay. And it's so funny because even now, like 10 years after me using cannabis, there's still people that are like, oh, but I've got this strain that you'll love. And I'm like, no, I will not. It's okay. And it's funny too, because like I like vapes and things like a little bit better, but it's, I don't know whether it's just like burning the plant, you know, it does cause other like toxins to be released, like ammonia and things like that. And I just seem to be really sensitive to that. And that's okay. And like, that's the thing I stress too with like patients that I talk to. I'm like, you know what? If one of the ways is not working for you, it's okay. Use the tinctures, use edibles, things like that. You don't have to smoke to get the medicinal effects. And, you know, for me, that's been very true. But there was a lot of stigma, you know, being in the industry, especially in the United States, when you're when you're in the cannabis industry and you're not a weed smoker, you sort of feel left out or, you know, a little bit stigmatized. But it's something that I come to terms with that I'm just not a good weed smoker, and that's okay. Want to just get back to fibromyalgia and why cannabis is such a good fit for it. Fibromyalgia has a lot of different symptoms. It's not a very simple disease. There's chronic pain, there's sleep issues, there's muscle spasms, there's inattention and focus and brain fog issues, there's gut issues and things like that. So there's a lot of things that are going wrong. And obviously, that's why there's so many different prescriptions prescribed for that. Cannabis, of course, has so many different ways that it works in the body. And it's amazing because it can replace all those prescriptions because it can inhibit muscle spasms, it can lower pain, it can improve focus depending on what you're taking and when you're taking it. You know, you can use it in topical manners for some of that nerve pain and things like that. And so for me, it has been one of really the things that have changed my life. After switching to cannabis products and getting off of all my pharmaceuticals, including opioids and things like that, my quality of life improved so much. So for me, that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate. You know, I try to get to every fibromyalgia patient I can, whether it's in person, whether it's, you know, online, you know, through articles and things like that, but just trying to reach people and let them know that there's an alternative to, you know, what they're using right now. Because cannabis, once you get it under, you know, you understand it and you know what works for you, it is going to change your life.
Well, I think that's a ringing endorsement if ever I heard one. And something I wanted to ask you about that we mentioned pre the interview, so not going to be news to you, but for our listeners, is you also do some work with Kratom, a Southeast Asian plant that I won't even talk about it other than to say that it's fairly recently been involved in the Western pharmacopoeia, but it seems to be doing very interesting things. And how does that holistically fit into your way of working? And perhaps you could give our listeners an overview of it because some of them might be less familiar.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's 1,000 different ways to pronounce kratom. You know, whether you're talking about the indigenous pronunciation or in the States, we call it kratom, but kratom, ketum, all those kind of things. Basically, it is a tea that is in the coffee plant family, and it works primarily on the opioid system, but doesn't have the same effects as a traditional opioid like morphine or fentanyl or oxycontin or anything like that, because it can't cause overdose because it doesn't activate the downstream pathways that cause respiratory depression or stopping your breathing. And so it's a safer, more natural way to get pain relief. And it's also interesting because it has the same abundance of different chemicals that cannabis does, right? Cannabis has THC and CBD and CBN and CBG and CBC and like all these terpenes and things like that. There's like hundreds of compounds in cannabis. There are hundreds of compounds in kratom too that have medicinal effects, and it works primarily on the opioid system, but it does have activity at other receptors. For example, the adrenergic system, acetylcholine, like all these different components of our brain chemistry. So Kratom is a tool that's being used, in certain countries and in the United States. There's about 10 million users of it here. But a lot of people who use CBD and cannabis also use Kratom. And for me, how I ended up going into Kratom, obviously, it wasn't something I knew about when I was working as a professor. It was something that is, it's more taboo in the United States because, again, of its association with opioids. I sort of wanted to understand why people used it. And from my understanding, it was that it is an energizing type of pain relief, whereas cannabis can be sort of a sleepy type of pain relief, right? A lot of the strains or products that are associated with pain relief tend to be indicas or things that are relaxing. And if you're a pain patient, right, you already have low energy, you're in a lot of pain, so you're gonna have to take high doses of, say, a cannabis edible or smoking cannabis strain, right? You're going to be using something really strong. That could make you sleepy during the day, or make you not be able to, say, do your work. If you're a busy professional with fibromyalgia like me, right, like I'm writing books and stuff, I can't be like snoozing during the day. I have to be on point. And for me, unfortunately, the dose that I need, for edibles to completely knock out my fibromyalgia pain is also the dose that makes me go to sleep. So unfortunately, like 10 years plus of using cannabis, and I still am not tolerant to the sleepy effects. It's hilarious. Like, you can give me a sativa and I will fall asleep. So my brain chemistry is hilarious. But for me, I was like, okay, I need to manage the pain without falling asleep. I'm fine with using cannabis at night. Like, it's great for me, take my 15-20 milligrams of THC at night. But what am I going to do about this pain during the day? Like, I can't just like grimace and like bear it. Like, the more active I get as a professional, and like that keeps happening with my business, like the more successful I am, the more I have to work, which leads me to more pain, which then makes me have to stop, like with fibro and things like that. So I have to be like, what can keep me the most functional, working at the highest level, performing at the highest level. And so for me, cannabis during the day was getting less and less effective, just because, again, it was making me tired or losing my focus. And so Kratom, because it's working the opioid system and some of these other systems, it provides focus, but it doesn't make you sleepy. And again, it's dose dependent, so you can take a lot and fall asleep, but for like the normal range of doses, between 1 and 5 grams. And I take, obviously, I'm a lightweight with everything, so I take less of the Kratom too. But I use Kratom in the morning instead of coffee, and it helps provide energy. It helps provide pain relief, gets me through my day. And then, towards the afternoon, evening is when I start consuming more cannabis products. And so for me, it's been a nice balance, because between cannabis and Kratom, I'm sort of hitting all the different systems in my body that are out of balance, right? The endocannabinoid system is out of balance. The opioid system is out of balance. Serotonin's out of balance. Acetylcholine's out of balance. If you look at somebody with fibromyalgia and you test them, like you test their brain or you test their bloodstream, like all our levels of everything are wrong. Like, basically our body is in pain and just causing everything to be out of balance all the time. And so for me, using Kratom and cannabis has been a really, really nice balance to just let me be more productive and work more hours than I have ever before. And I've been really grateful for that. Some patients will use, say, CBD and Kratom together. So that way they're managing their pain using low doses of both types of products, and they're not having to worry about, say, opioid dependence or things like that, where a patient that might be on morphine, for example, like they definitely have to worry about overdose and addiction and things like that. Whereas if you just use Kratom and small amounts of cannabis, it's going to be a situation that's much safer for a chronic pain patient. I could talk about Kratom all day. It's really exciting. I actually have a new book called Kratom as Medicine that is coming out. But, I think it's so important for people to remember, when we talk about cannabis, it's like, you can't talk about these plant medicines in isolation, right? Like, I think you need to talk about all the options. Let's talk about CBD, cannabis, Kratom, medicinal mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, right? Like, there's this whole plant-based toolbox that we should be looking to when we're talking about healing someone, both their physical pain, their emotional pain, their spiritual pain, all that kind of stuff. And for so long, we've just been like talking about like cannabis, and it's just like, really, when you get down to it and you talk to somebody and you try to figure out what's off balance with their brain, what kind of pain are they showing? Do they have trauma? Like, do they have gut issues? Like, all these different things you got to figure out. Okay, there's a plant for each of these type of symptoms, right? And for one person, it might not just be just one plant. It's usually a mixture of plant that is really helpful for them. And so that's the conversation that I'm happy to, be starting out about, destigmatizing all these different plants and being able to use them together, and also destigmatize the fact that, like, if you use cannabis and kratom and mushrooms and all these things, you're not a drug addict. You're a patient that's using plant medicine responsibly.
I've got a couple of questions here, and forgive the fact that these ones actually aren't very interlinked at all, but I wanted to sort of mention them, but before they fly out of my mind. So the first one is sort of looking around specifically on Kratom and sort of looking at the legalities around it for folks that might be tuning in that aren't so well versed in Kratom. What are the sort of legalities around obtaining and using it in a therapeutic setting in the US and perhaps further afield? And then the second question before it flies out of my head, and that is, you mentioned about how lots of people like to use cannabis and kratom and other plant medicines synergistically. When you are using different plant medicines in a synergistic way, what is the best way to find and ascertain the sort of therapeutic dose that works best for patients? Is there a sort of certain ratios of certain plant medicines that you should be using when you're using them together, or is it sort of more feeling it out?
So to answer the first question about the legality of kratom, so it is very stigmatized and misunderstood, just like the cannabis plant. So we have this patchwork of different countries that have made kratom illegal. Even the United States, where it is actually legal and it's not on our drug schedules like cannabis, there are some states and some cities that have banned it because they thought it was part of the opioid epidemic and causing deaths. And now they know that the deaths aren't really linked to the kratom use. It's linked to, maybe other drugs that were mixed into products that people had taken, or other drugs they had consumed at the same time as kratom. But we're actually in the process in the United States of trying to undo some of the bans that happened in cities that were misinformed. But in the United States in general, it's mostly legal. There are 6 states that banned it. And then there's some major cities like San Diego, California banned it. But I live in Las Vegas, which is one of 4 states where they passed Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which means that the kratom has to be lab tested, similar to CBD or cannabis. It's got to be safe. It's got to have, labeling on it to say what's in it and how potent, say, the major alkaloids or chemicals in kratom are, so like what you're getting. So it's being regulated very similarly to hemp products in these states. And so one of the reasons why I'm in Nevada is because it is a state that protects both the patients, the consumers that use it, as well as the people that sell it. And I do sell a line of kratom. In the UK, unfortunately, it's not legal. There's still a lot of stigma about it, as well as, the cannabis plant, obviously, in the UK. There is a patchwork of countries in Europe that have banned kratom, and I hope that it does change over time as people understand the drug a little bit better. But yeah, it's one of the things with kratom is that you sort of have to go and look up and see where is it even legal where I am, and also if you're a traveler, right? I tell Americans all the time, I'm like, you know what, it might be your pain management method here. Be careful, check if you are driving or flying somewhere that it's okay to fly with what you have, because that's scary. Like when you show up through customs or something and they're like, you've been bringing drugs into our country and you think it's just like a simple tea, right? Like kratom is basically a tea. It's drink like it looks honestly like matcha green tea. Like it looks so like innocuous. It's not like a white powder. It doesn't look like cocaine or something like that. It literally looks like green matcha powder. And so sometimes people are very confused when they find out that that's illegal where they are. Personally, I don't think it should be illegal anywhere, but that's something that we are trying to, to overturn the stigma and the bans that are in some of the countries. But that's one thing. But in terms of using kratom and cannabis, CBD, other functional plant medicines together, I really do caution against, say, using them all the same time, just because we don't know as much about interactions. It's important to remember that all medicines, whether they're prescription or plant medicines, can cause drug interactions. And for example, like you take cannabis and a prescription drug, cannabis might influence how your prescription drug is metabolized. It might increase the blood levels of those drugs. The same thing happens sometimes when you use some of these plant medicines together. So CBD, for example, might extend the amount of time that kratom is in your system, or the kratom alkaloid. So I try to counsel people, just because, again, we don't know as much about these different drugs being used together. Like, I don't think somebody should go take magic mushrooms and kratom and cannabis all at the same time. You'll probably be sick. You probably won't feel good. You'll be sick instead. So I tell patients really, if you're going to use these things, to use them sort of at different times, right? So talking about me personally, right? I use Kratom in the morning. I don't use CBD with it. I don't use cannabis with it. I use Kratom in the morning. It lasts about 2 to 4 hours. And so like that's my morning dose is just Kratom. When that wears off, I might take some CBD. When that wears off, then it's cannabis time. So the THC time. So for me, I sort of make specific times in the day where I use the different substances. And I'm sort of cognizant of how long they last and how long they're in my system. So I'm not trying to use them all at the same time. And I think that's really the safest way to take some of these substances. Again, because most people are on some prescriptions, right? There's some people that are, aren't on anything. They only use plant medicine, but in reality, people are on different medications and things like that. And one of the things that I counsel people on, I'm like, literally, you need like a little day planner, like with the hours, and be like, okay, when are you taking your dose of medication? When are you going to take your cannabis, or when are you going to take your kratom? And we go over and we try to make sure that there aren't any drug-drug interactions. And I know that sounds sometimes complicated, but imagine if you took something, right, and say your medication made kratom levels really high in your system, and then it made you super nauseous or made you throw up, right? Like that's not a good outcome. Or you took your kratom and it made this other prescription drug you're on, it increased the blood levels of that and made you sick. Like the whole goal here is to take, these plant medicines safely, but to also remember that they are plant medicines. They are medicines. So they do have activities and your liver enzymes that break down drugs. They do have activities, in your brain. And so you have to remember how to use them safely. And so I would caution people from, smoking weed, doing kratom, like doing all the things at the same time, really use them with intention. Again, and the best way to use them is separately. So when I say people are using CBD or cannabis and kratom together, I don't mean particularly that they're using them at the same time. I mean that the same patient is using both of those tools, and they might not even be using them the same day. They might be using them as, hey, I had a really bad pain flare, and so I'm going to go reach for the kratom. But normally I use cannabis on low pain days or something like that. So for every patient, it's different how they use it. But I would say, when you're using these strong plant medicines, to really think about how you use them and try not to use them all together, because that's going to increase the risk of adverse side effects.
Well, I feel that's a very comprehensive answer on the topic of combining the two. Basically don't, for a risk of a bad interaction, if I had to sum it up from a non-medical perspective. And I think staying on a similar topic, where do you think is next in the realm of plant medicine? Because I think lots of modern medicine, let's say, is based originally on plants. Then you have your willow bark, then you isolate your single molecule, then you call it aspirin, then you put it in a little pill, and then it's very consistent and the same each time. Do you think the plant medicine revolution that we're seeing now is likely to end up in that sort of distilled and consistent form factor once more, but perhaps with a different reckoning with multiple ingredients? Or do you think where we are now is where we're likely to stay?
That's a great question. So we're starting to see sort of like combo products right now in the market with medicinal mushrooms. So we're seeing CBD products with medicinal mushrooms in them, and cannabis products with medicinal mushrooms. And just so the listeners know, medicinal mushrooms are not the ones that make you high. They're not magic mushrooms. We're talking about things like cordyceps mushrooms or lion's mane or reishi mushrooms. But we're seeing a combination of those products, and that's because they do offset, say, some of the symptoms, like the adverse things of cannabis, right? So if you're worried, hey, I'm going to take an edible product during the day, but it's going to make me spacey. It's going to help relieve my pain, but it'll make me spacey, not focus. Well, you might want to take an edible with lion's mane in it, because it's going to improve focus and brain health and everything like that. So people are starting to formulate these components, I would say, of the natural medicines in a safe way, or combining, say, like cannabis terpenes and medicinal mushrooms. Like there's all sorts of things that are happening right now, like literally in the last couple of months, which are really exciting. And that way, it's much more safer, I feel like, when they're formulated by like scientists, rather than something being like, okay, I got these mushrooms over here, I'm going to take this product and hope for the best. Like, let's, try to put a little bit of science and safety around it. But in terms of, not dispensary products more on the pharmaceutical end. I think that there is going to be a lot of development in products because, to be quite honest, a lot of the products that are sold in dispensaries or sold psychedelic mushrooms are sold, legally in dispensaries and things like that. They're being developed as pharmaceutical products. A lot of the ways that people take natural plant medicines are not that bioavailable, and so that means that they are not absorbed fully by the body. One example of this is, the different kratom alkaloids. There's one called mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, which are the two active ingredients in kratom. And like, if you drink the kratom tea, it tastes horrible. Like, it tastes like the worst green matcha tea in your life. Like, you have to sweeten it, put juice in it. Like, it's disgusting, right? But like, if you're a pain patient, you'll take anything to be out of pain. So like, I put chocolate and raspberry in mine. Like, I actually created my own tea, like, to make it better. But like, it's gross. And so, you drink this tea and then you're only absorbing like 2 or 3% of the alkaloids in it that are actually the pain meds. There's got to be a better way to, use these products, right? There's got to be, say, water soluble alkaloids, right? That you could put into a regular drink and make it normal tasting like you do with CBD. So I think that we're going to see a maturation of some of these plant medicine industries and making, I would say, easier to consume forms of these products. I also think that we will see some of the combinations of like, hey, is it safe to take, say, 5 milligrams of CBD, what the active ingredient of kratom, say mitragynine or 7-hydroxymitragynine, in like, say, a sublingual form? Like, there's going to be all these combo products in the future that are targeted. I think that we'll be able to figure out, hey, if a fibro patient needs energy and pain relief and focus, well, we can use a combination of kratom, CBD, cannabis terpenes, maybe some medicinal mushrooms, and we're going to have this like full functional, formulation for different diseases. I think that's where we're moving, and I think that those things are going to be a lot safer than the like polypharma combination that people are currently on, like taking morphine and an antidepressant and an anti-anxiety drug and a sleep med is basically a prescription for death. Like, I'm surprised that there aren't more overdoses and things like that. I think that moving towards natural plant medicines is the future. I think that we sort of screwed up with making so many, pharmaceuticals that seemed maybe safe, possibly safe by themselves, but not are safe. They're not safe at all when they're prescribed with like 10 other drugs. So I think that the future really is both development, I would say, of just natural medicines that are combining these different things and also pharmaceuticals. And I think that too, a lot of these ingredients, right? Like, there's so much that can be done in terms of changing the molecular structure of some of these compounds, right? So it's like you add a hydrochloride, you can modify these chemical structures to make them more bioavailable or to work stronger at different receptors and things like that. And so I think we are going to see a pharmaceuticalization of some of these compounds. Some people like that, some people don't. It's like, oh no, don't mess with indigenous medicine and things like that. You have people that are very much leave the plant medicine alone. You have other people who are saying, hey, you know what, if I don't have to drink this yucky green tea like 3 times a day and I could just use a capsule of the active ingredient and it makes my pain go away, I'll take the capsule. So I think that there's going to be development on both sides and making novel products and more effective products. And as a pain patient, my goal really is to be out of pain and to help as many people be out of pain as possible. So I'm for both the development of the natural plant medicine sort of formulations and supplements, and I'm also for the different pharmaceuticals that are probably going to be coming down the pipeline in the next 10 years.
I understand the reticence from some quarters to touch plant medicine because I think there's a lot of people who say the medical establishment completely left this behind, but it worked for me, and now I don't trust that it can be done correctly. But my personal belief is probably with more research, better products, you'll get better patient outcomes. So I probably find myself not on the extreme of any pole of that debate.
And I just wanted to add too, one of the things I touch on in my book is actually like the future state of kratom, right? Here we have something that literally is just being it's drank as a tea, right? And there's like no novel uses or no innovation in it so far. And it was like the ability to take this and make it into skincare or into pain relief topicals and things like that. I think that there are so many natural plant medicines that are sort of like not been as sexy or as like looked at as cannabis, right? But there are so many of them out there. And I think that we're just starting, to really focus on it, right? Like mushrooms weren't cool like 5 years ago, and all of a sudden we're seeing this resurgence of even medicinal mushrooms because people are talking about psychedelic mushrooms, right? Like now it's
Mhm.
cool to be talking about lion's mane. Like years ago, like you could have mentioned that, and people are like, I don't know what that is. Like, what are you talking about? And now everybody's talking about medicinal mushrooms. It's cool. It's in all the different products. Like, does your CBD have medicinal mushrooms in it? No? Okay, pass. People are looking for these functional ingredients now. And so I think that, it's a really exciting time to be in the industry because I think that there are many opportunities to develop these products, to use these products. And I think medicine is really changing.
You are an absolute rock star, and we have really, really loved speaking with you. So, Michele, thank you so much for joining us on the Professionally Cannabis podcast.
Thank you. It has been a great conversation.
Please take me above, take me with you.